is Carol Cain. I'm the Associate Director of the National WASP World War II Museum at Avenger Field in Sweetwater, Texas. And the WASP were the Women Air Force Service Pilots. These were the first women to fly America's military aircraft. They trained at Avenger Field in Sweetwater in 1943 and 1944, therefore making Avenger Field the only all-female military training base in U.S. history. 5 days a week, sometimes 7 days a week, I am privileged to tell the story of these wonderful women. I'm going to start out today, and honestly, I have been so busy, I have not turned mine and did not check to see the topic of what today's conversation is supposed to be, but I think we're going to not only discuss the WASP, but discuss Cornelia Fort, who has a very strong permanent connection to this part of West Texas. I want to start out first. We were talking back here about the glider training base in Lubbock. I'm going to start by sort of refreshing your memory on the sequence of time in aviation as the United States drifted into World War II. You've got to remember that the Wright brothers first flew at Kitty Hawk in 1904. By 1943, we were using aircraft not only for military purposes, small airlines were cropping up all over the United States. Aircraft were privately owned. They had become so popular after the surplus planes from World War II came back that it was not unusual for ranchers and farmers in this area to buy surplus aircraft to use in their day-to-day operations. There was a WASP from Looters, Mary Alice Vanderbilt. She learned to fly when she was 15 years old. You could get a pilot's license when you were 14, but you had to be 16 to get a driver's license. And can you imagine being outside in your yard and looking up and a Stearman biplane flies over and there's a real possibility that there could be two 14-year-olds in that plane. It was amazing. Aviation was not only a means of transportation, it was a means of self-gratification, it was a means of entertainment, and it was a means of excitement. West Texas was a hotbed for military training bases. Our museum is part of a 7 West Texas World War II Military Museum Association. It starts here in Abilene. We configured our association so that any of you could visit all 7 of these museums in one weekend. So we kept it contained to this part of Texas. Starting in Abilene with the 12th Armored Division, that I hope all of you have visited that wonderful museum. The 12th Armored Division was the tank division that liberated so many of the Nazi concentration camps. The thing about museums is that I always ask school children when they come, do you know what a museum is? And some of them say, well, my father told me it's a place where I won't have very much fun. Or my mom said, while you're in a museum, you have your hands in your pockets. A museum is where we preserve things of value, whether it's historic value, or monetary value, or educational value. It is a place where something is maintained not just for us, but for generations to come. Therefore, it is so important that these military museums be maintained in West Texas. The 12th Armored was established by members of that 12th Armored Tank Division. Avenger Field is the second of the museums that you can visit. It was established by the WASP themselves. They started in 1997. The museum opened in 2005. If you stay west on I-20, you get to Big Spring. Big Spring was a military training base in World War II, and Hangar 25 is located on one of the old runways to maintain the history of what went on there. If you keep going west on I-20, you get to Monahans. Monahans is 12 miles from Pyote, and Pyote was the home of the Rattlesnake Bomber Base. Rattlesnake Bomber Base, like most of these other military bases, was thrown up in haste to train pilots for World War II. Rattlesnake Bomber Base was where the B-17, the B-25, and especially the B-29 crews worked together, trained together for anywhere between 6 to 8 weeks before they were sent into combat. After the war was over, Rattlesnake Bomber Base was where they mothballed so many of the bombers that came back from World War II. Then Enola Gay was mothballed at Pyote, but was saved for being a museum, historic purposes. But most of those B-29s that came back were just cut into pieces and smelted down on site. And it's heart-wrenching to go there. There's nothing left, but you can walk through, dodge the rattlesnakes, and you can see huge puddles of aluminum that as they were smelting down these planes, this was where from the soldering and cutting with the tools just left puddles of aluminum all over those sand dunes. When you get to Sweetwater, if you head northeast toward Lubbock, you get to Slayton, and the Texas Air Museum is in Slayton. And this museum, most museums sort of have parameters of what they are going to show in their museum. This museum, if it ever flew, they've got it. If they could find the wings from that little Greek guy that put wax on his arms and glued on feathers, they would have those feathers there. They go from the very beginning of aviation through the space age, and then you get to Lubbock with the Silent Wings Museum, which was a glider training base. So, if you have any interest at all in seeing some of the history that's been preserved pre-World War II and World War II, I have planned a weekend for you now. So next weekend, nobody can stay at home. So what I'm going to do, we're going to start with a very brief 4-minute video that's going to give you the history of the women Air Force service pilots. And then we're going to talk about Cornelia Ford. I am not an expert on Cornelia Ford, but she is part of the WASP story. So, Ariel, all I have to do is hit
play
button.
There was a shortage of military pilots, and the majority of male pilots were needed for combat. A call was made for experienced female pilots to supplement the male pilots in some non-combat roles. These WASP, Women Air Force Service Pilots, were considered civil servants.
We finally were recognized as veterans in 1977.
After 30 years of no recognition or benefits from serving our country in World War II, the WASP united and lobbied Congress for 3 years for their just military recognition. In 1974, Congressman Barry Goldwater, who had flown with them in the war, took up their cause, and Congress gave them military status in 1977, so they could be buried in a military cemetery with a flag on their coffin at last, and they could use Veteran Administration hospitals. In 2010, Texas Senator Kay Bailey Hutchison pushed for the bill which awarded the WASP Congressional Gold Medal. They were the third military unit to receive this distinguished recognition, after the Tuskegee Airmen and the Navajo Code Talkers. Finally, they have found their place in history and the National WASP World War II Museum at Avenger Field, where they received their training, serves the nation by keeping this important piece of U.S. history alive. When the B-29, dubbed the Super Fortress, was first introduced to the male pilots, they were very skittish about flying the fiery plane because this last bomber, developed during the war, had a tendency to catch fire after takeoff. Paul Tibbets, who later piloted the Enola Gay when it dropped the bomb on Hiroshima, was at that time a young lieutenant colonel in charge of training for the B-29 at Salina. He decided to show to men that the plane could safely be flown by having two WASP demonstrate that they could easily fly the big bomber. He spent a couple of days training WASP Dora Dougherty and Dorothea Johnson at another air base, had T. Vanilla painted on the B-29's nose, and named the plane Ladybird. Using an adjusted pre-flight procedure, these two brave fly girls put on a little air show for his men, ending the grumbling among the male pilots.
We would surprise the towers every once in a while when they would see a B-25 in the pattern, and a girl would call in for landing instructions. And at one point, I was told that to please get off the radio, there was a B-25 trying to come. Then I informed them that I was the B-25 and there was British silence on the radio. And then they finally gave me permission to land.
They just weren't sure women could learn to fly military plane. I flew mostly fighters, P-51 Mustangs.
Unlike the male pilots, the Wasp who died in crashes had no death benefits. The 38 who died serving our country were shipped home with no funds and no escort except that provided by her sister pilots or their family. The girls themselves would usually pass the hat to ship the body of their friend home, and one would ask for permission to escort the plain pine box with no flag on it to a non-military burial. The female pilots who gave their lives in World War II were not considered as part of the military because they were women.
Historically, it's accurate because it's right on the exact location at Avenger Field where they flew. You can still see parts of the history, the sign that shows Avenger Field in the Fee-Fanilla.
Countless volunteers and supporters have dug deep into their pockets and given of their time and talents to build a lasting tribute to the Wasp and their legacy at Avenger Field in Sweetwater, Texas. Hangar 1 was opened in 2005 with 29 Wasp in attendance who left their handprints in concrete for posterity. The circa 1929 hangar has grown with the recreation of a barracks sleeping bag, the addition of a flying PT-19, a bronze, the Graduate, sculpted and donated by Wasp Dot Swain Lewis, and an exhibit dedicated to the life and legacy of the Director of Training and record-breaking pilot Jacqueline Cochran, plus much, much more. Now the museum has moved to the next level by expanding to provide a climate-controlled environment in order to preserve and display more of the precious artifacts from this fascinating, unique American experience, the advent of women pilots in the military. National support is needed for the expansion of the National Wasp World War II Museum to continue its mission.
That little blurb about
During World War II,
raising funds
military pilots
is added at the end because this is a DVD that when we write for grants, we include this DVD in our grant request. So I'm not here to raise funds for the Wasp Museum. I'm here to share their story. 1,074 women graduated at Avenger Field in Sweetwater. After graduation, they were deployed to 126 duty bases all over the United States. Their job was to free male pilots who were piloting aircraft within the continental United States, which were sort of housekeeping jobs. The WASP program was to take the places of these men. Of the 1,074 who graduated, 38 died in service to their country. 11 died in training at or around Avenger Field. 26 of them died after they were deployed to duty bases all over the United States. They were employed by the civil service, but they were under the auspices of the U.S. military. Of those 1,074 women, each one of them had their own personal story. They were a very diverse group. They ranged in age from 18 to 35. They came from all walks of life. Some came straight from the farm. They had learned to fly from a barnstormer, or their father or uncle had bought a surplus airplane, and a barnstormer would, if you would let him keep if the farmer or the rancher would let the pilot keep his plane in the barn, they would be willing to teach somebody on the farm or ranch how to fly. Most adults didn't want to learn to fly, so therefore the 14-year-olds were able to take advantage of flight training. To even apply for the program, you already had to have a private or a commercial pilot's license. Cornelia, who we're going to talk about in just a few minutes, when she applied for the program, she had over 500 hours of cockpit time. Most men who had served in the service for 2 or 3 years had not acquired that many hours in the cockpit. Cornelia was part of the WAFS, the Women Auxiliary Ferrying Service. That program was founded by Nancy Harkness Love. Jacqueline Cochran and Hap Arnold were trying to get the government to open a program for women to take over the positions in all areas of military flying in the United States. Nancy Love's husband worked for the Ferrying Command, and what she wanted to do was just have these experienced women pilots ferry planes from the manufacturing point to where they were needed, either training bases or de-embarkation points to go into combat. When Cornelia Fort was killed, she was flying a BT-13. A BT-13 was the basic trainer that was assigned to Avenger Field. When the girls got there, they started out in a PT-17, which was the old biplane made by the old Stearman biplane. After they passed their check ride in that plane, they moved to a PT-19, which was basically the same aircraft except it had a single wing. Both of those airplanes were open cockpit. Pilot and co-pilot, our instructor and trainee sat one in front of the other. After you passed your check ride on those 2 aircraft, you went to the basic trainer, which was the BT-13. Today, there are a group of 9 men in Minneapolis, Minnesota, who have restored a BT-13. They have spent the last 5 years restoring this aircraft, and they are presenting it, they are gifting it to our museum, and it should arrive the middle of August. So keep your eyes and ears open and come in and see the arrival of that aircraft. After the basic trainer, they went to the AT-6, which was the training plane that they trained in for fighters and pursuit planes. They also had at Avenger Field, the twin engine trainer was the UC-78. And our museum has the skeleton, the framework of a UC-78 that we've traced its serial numbers back, and it was actually based at Avenger Field, and the WASP flew it. We have just opened our new hangar number 1, which is a climate-controlled hangar. There's nothing in it, but boy, is it pretty from the outside. Homecoming was May the 27th, and we had our homecoming festivities in this new climate-controlled hangar, which was wonderful. 11 WASP came back from homecoming. The surviving WASP, we don't know if there are 83 or 85. There are 2 WASP that we have lost contact with in the last couple of years, so we don't know their status, but there are either 83 or 85 surviving WASP. The youngest is 93. There are 2 that are 103, and at homecoming, the 27th of May, we celebrated the 101st birthday of a WASP. And you don't think we were walking on pins and needles knowing that we were having a birthday party for a 101-year-old, and she was flying in. She was agile and attentive and conscious of where she was. She was absolutely wonderful. These women, the spirit that motivated them to leave home, to leave families, to give up careers, to fly for their country, the spirit that possessed them to do that in the 1940s, they still maintain as elder statesmen. They are truly American legacies. I do have to share one personal thing with you all. I did not live in Sweetwater, but my husband grew up there. So when he retired, we moved back, and I have been associated with the Houston Museum of Natural Science for the 40-some-odd years that we had been in Houston, so it sort of was natural for me to gravitate to the WASP Museum, which was only 2 years old then. There was not a lot there, but the WASP story was there. And I took, our granddaughters came to visit, and I took our youngest granddaughter to this museum, told them the WASP story, and as we were leaving this hot, hot August day, the asphalt was just bubbling on the parking lot. Molly looked up at me and said, Precious, my grandchildren call me Precious. I gave them the choice. They could call me Precious or they could call me Mrs. Cain. So they opted for Precious. But Molly looked up at me and said, Precious, I can do anything I want to do, can't I? There's not anything I can't do if I want to do it. And that was when I was hooked on the legacy of these women. As the mother of 2 daughters and the grandmother of 2 granddaughters, the traits, the character traits that these women possessed are the character traits that every parent wants their daughter to possess. Service, patriotism, courage, stick-to-itiveness, not letting people talk you out of something that you really want to do, and last of all, making up your mind that no matter how hard the work, you're going to work that hard to meet a goal. Those are traits that we can only hope, and I'm sure all of us do possess those traits, but certainly that's what we would like for our younger generations now to possess. As different as these women were, they had 2 things in common. First of all, they loved to fly, and secondly, they loved their country. They would have flown for free. When the program closed in 1944, these women would have flown for free if the government had let them. Instead, the program was closed December 1944. Their records were sealed, and a lot of base commanders, as the WASP were paying their own way to get back home, the base commanders were telling them not to talk about what they had done. It was an experimental program. The bill for militarization had passed the House, but it had failed the Senate, and it was mainly because of gender bias. If you compare the records of the WASP to other male pilots, they are almost identical. They are almost identical, except the fact that the women were easier to train than the men. And I don't know if you all are fishermen or not, but I had a fly fishing instructor who said he'd much rather teach a woman to fish than a man, because a woman would listen to him and a man would think he already knew. So I have to tell that. I'm not too gender biased, but I am just a little bit. I am partial to women. Cornelia Fort is important to us in this part of Texas because she was the first woman to die in military service for her country. And she crashed right out here at Mulberry Canyon. That there is a Texas historic marker, and I've got the intersection, at the intersection of Highway 126 and Farm to Market 1085 in Mulberry Canyon. I'm not an expert on Cornelia Fort. I can't be an expert on all 1,074, but I tell her story almost every day when people tour the museum, and I'm going to read parts of this book. This is when it turns into a book review as opposed to an educational lecture. It was a glorious Sunday morning, not yet 8 o'clock, and Cornelia Fort was flying. She and a student pilot had risen from the runways of Honolulu's John Rogers Airport into a brightening blue sky, dotted with lazy, fair-weather clouds. To the west lay Pearl Harbor and its crowded, still sleeping naval base, and beyond that, fields of sugarcane. Past the industrial areas to the north, they could see forest and the Mulu Mountains. The Pacific rolled behind them to the south, to the east, and toward the strengthening sun was Waikiki down ahead in downtown Honolulu. No one who knew Cornelia would have expected her to be anywhere but in the air on a morning like this. Just 22 years old and a pilot of less than 2 years, she was already one of the nation's most experienced flyers. She had earned her commercial and instructor's license within a year and had begun teaching, leaving behind her family's Nashville estate for a job in Fort Collins, Colorado. For 2 months now, since October 1941, she had been working at Honolulu's Andrews Flying Service. Her student, a defense worker, was practicing takeoffs and landings in an interstate cadet. A cadet was a very small aircraft, but it held a pilot and a co-pilot, and they sat side by side. A tiny two-seater owned by the flying service. Cornelia would later write about what happened next. Cornelia had gone to Sarah Lawrence College, and she had a wonderful writing skill. This book, it contains lots of letters and editorials that she wrote for different newspapers and magazines. And this is what she wrote about that Sunday morning. Just prior to the last landing, I was going to have him, her student, make before soloing. I looked casually around and saw a military plane coming in from the sea. We were so used to military aircraft and our respective safety zones that I merely noticed his position subconsciously and nodded to my student to make his turn into the base leg of the traffic pattern. Then I turned to look around to see if it was clear to make that last turn into the field and saw another airplane coming directly toward us. I jerked the controls away from my student and jammed the throttle wide open to pull above the oncoming aircraft. Her letters are written teeny tiny little font, guys, so I am squinting, forgive me. The throttle wide open to pull above the oncoming plane. I remember a distinct feeling of annoyance that the Army plane had disrupted our traffic patterns and violated our safety zone. He passed so close under us that our celluloid windshield rattled violently, and I looked down to see what kind of a plane it was. The painted red balls on the top of the wings shone brightly in the sun. I looked again with complete and utter disbelief. Honolulu was familiar with the emblem of the rising sun on passenger ships, but not on airplanes. I looked quickly at Pearl Harbor and my spine tingled when I saw billowing black smoke. Still, I thought, hollowly, it might be some kind of coincidence or maybe maneuvers. It might be, it must be, for surely, oh God. Then I looked way up and saw formations of silver bombers riding in. I saw something detach itself from a plane and come glistening down. My eyes followed it down, 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 and even with knowledge pounding in my mind, my heart turned over convulsively when the bomb exploded in the middle of the harbor. Cornelia Fort was probably the third American to see the Japanese as they invaded Pearl Harbor. Two other pilots were shot down before the Japanese fighters reached Honolulu. Their bodies washed up on the east side of the island a couple of weeks later, and their planes were small planes like this little Cub, were riddled with bullets. Cornelia immediately realized what had happened. She landed, she and her student pilot jumped out and ran for cover, but not after they had been hit during strafing in the air, and then one Japanese fighter turned around, came back, and strafed this little airplane on the ground. A sub-note to Cornelia's airplane. About 5 years ago, they were going through a hangar in Honolulu and found a little yellow and blue Cub in the back of one of these abandoned hangars, and it was the plane that she was flying. It has been restored and is now airworthy and is touring air shows and going to World War II memorial events, and especially Pearl Harbor events. I'm sorry, I have a magazine story of its restoration, and I, forgive me, totally forgot to put it in my backpack for you to see. But before Cornelia got to Honolulu, she was born in Memphis, Tennessee, to a very wealthy family. Her father was a physician, but he was the founder of National American Insurance Company, which went on during the Depression. He became a millionaire while most businesses were floundering, simply for the fact that he was providing a service at a cost that even people who had lost their means of support were able to afford. Cornelia was one of 6 children. She had a younger sister, and she had 4 brothers. After World War I, when these planes were coming back to the United States and people were flying planes for fun, Dr. Fort made his 4 sons pledge that they would never fly. Cornelia watched these young men in her father's study promise their father that they would never fly one of those newfangled airplanes, but she was only 5 years old, so she was left out of the "I pledge I will never fly an airplane." She, her description was that she got her mother's tall stature, her father's square jaw, and deep forehead. She was not an unattractive woman. I'm going to pass this around in a minute for you to see. And by the by, this book is for sale in our gift shop if you want to delve further into Cornelia Fort. But she was not unattractive, but she was gangly. She had a very sharp mind, but her father was very, very, very strict. He sent his children to public school until they were ready for high school. Then he sent them to a very prestigious private high school where they were taught to, and how can you put this? They were taught how to live up to their place in Southern society. It was expected that the young men from this school would go on to be successful business people. The young women would marry successful men and go on to have a place in their local society, wherever it was. Cornelia did not fit into that. She was not a fine athlete, but she was a fearless athlete. There were horses on her father's estate, and her riding instructor said she rode with wild abandon. She learned to drive early, and while she could have afforded a Cadillac, she drove a Chevrolet. She wanted to go, her father would not let her travel when all of her friends after high school were going to Europe. He said that he had never been to Europe and that he didn't see any need for his children to go to Europe. But Cornelia had a wanderlust. She knew that there was more to life than the social position that women in the South were supposed to live. She finally persuaded her father to let her go to Sarah Lawrence in New York, and which was a very progressive women's school. Her writing skills were put to good use because she was the editor of the Sarah Lawrence newspaper. She took an interest in national politics, and she wrote article after article about America's position in World War II, and stayed abreast of what was going on in Europe when it was very unpopular for young women to not only to be brides, but especially to be bright and have an interest in politics. After lots of endeavors for her 2 years in college, she discovered flying and took to it immediately. Therefore, the title of this book, Daughters of the Air. She was a true daughter of the air. She had gotten her pilot's license in a very, very short period of time, went on to teach at a flying school in the South. Then, as the war was beginning to, as it became, we became aware that we would soon enter World War II, she taught at a private flight school in Colorado, and then was invited to come and teach at this flight school in Honolulu. Therefore, she was there when World War II broke out. She came, after Pearl Harbor, she came back to the United States, and Nancy Harkness had pushed through, she had gotten acceptance to start the WAFS, the Women Auxiliary Ferrying Service, which was under the auspice of Nancy Harkness Love. Cornelia Fort was the third woman to sign up for that program. These were the first women to fly for the United States Army Air Force, and they had to have 500 hours of cockpit time to apply for the program. She went on to ferry planes, gaining more and more experience. There were 77 different aircraft in the U.S. Army Air Corps arsenal at that time. Not every WASP or not every WAF flew all 77 planes, but at one time or the other, a WAF or WASP flew every one of those planes. They're the only unit in military history who has flown every single plane in our Army, in the Army Air Force arsenal. These women truly put the first crack in the glass ceiling for women to have aviation careers, whether they be private, commercial, or military. Today, at Dives are B-1 bombers, there are B-1 bomber pilots, there are all female B-1B crews, there are a woman on our board, Bridget McNamara. Colonel Bridget McNamara was the first B-1 bomber flight instructor. She was at Dives until she was transferred to the Pentagon. When you talk to these young women pilots today, they will everyone tell you that, is this bothering you as much as it's bothering me out of the corner of my eye? I don't know, Ariel. Shall I just unplug?
Well, it stopped.
It stopped,
No,
good.
so-
Good. Today, it's so funny, when you talk to young women who are flying, especially in the military, if they are wait, I will do it the grandmother's way.
There was a shortage of military.
Yeah. Yes, when you can't figure out what to do, cut the They are called, it's so funny, they call themselves, no, not Lady, I will think of it, I'm having a senior moment. There is a name that female fighter pilots call one another. It'll come to me. Anyway, Cornelia went on for almost 2 years, served with the WAFs. The WAFs merged with the WASP, and they were doing their job as America became really embedded in World War II. This is the last part that I'm going to read, and then you can ask questions. I'll try to answer. Again, I'm not the Cornelia Ford expert that I should be. I guess I'm flying false colors here today. This was Cornelia's last day. The flight to Dallas took Cornelia back over the same long open stretch of desert with which she had become so familiar. She was, after just a few weeks, much more relaxed about the route. What she's doing is she had been assigned to ferry BT-13s from Long Beach to Dallas, Long Beach, California, where they were manufactured. She was, after all, after just a few weeks, much more relaxed about the route. She took off at 9 a.m. on Sunday, March 21st, from Tucson and landed at 12:45 in Midland to refuel. She chatted at the airport snack bar with a group of male pilots from Long Beach who were also headed to Dallas, and after a while, the conversation turned into formation flying. Some of the pilots had flown formation while in training, although they too were forbidden to do so while on ferrying missions. The WASP instructions when they ferried planes was to take off, to stay in a group, hopefully with eyesight, so that one of them would not wander off and be lost, but they were not to fly. They had no formation flying. Their orders were not to fly in formation and not to engage in any aerial acrobats or in any dogfighting. They weren't to buzz schools or churches or farms or herds of cattle. They were to take off, fly directly from point A to point B. Some of the pilots had flown formation while in training, although they too were forbidden to do so while on ferrying missions. Like the WAFs, they were to maintain a 500-foot distance from anything in the sky. But over country this remote, it might be fun to practice. My recollection, said Louis Biggio, a second lieutenant in the airport group, is that Cornelia had never done that. And she said, I'd like to try it. She was a little hesitant, and I don't remember whether we tried to talk her into it or not. The other pilots told her that she might simply fly straight and level, and they would fly on her wing. Another lieutenant, Frank Wiggins, said he wanted no part of it, and he would see them in Dallas. Frank Wiggins went ahead. The rest agreed to meet in the air. Wiggins went ahead and took off. To save time, 6 male pilots signed out their ships on flight plans filed by Wiggins. Wiggins had already gone, and this group was following behind. They took off at 2:37 p.m. and met at 7,000 feet over the rugged West Texas Mesa for the 2-hour flight. Cornelia brought her airspeed to 140 miles an hour, as did the others. We were headed eastward flying formation, said Biggio, changing positions sometimes, switching around from right wing to left wing. We weren't any too close, just flying the way we would in training. It was fun. We were young and full of vigor, and none of us even considered the possibility of the consequences. Irving was one of the 6 pilots, confirmed that they were flying formation. Just practicing, I guess, noting that this was a group of young pilots just out of flight school over 90 days, not out of flight school over 90 days. They were very, very young and very inexperienced, he said. The group flew south to Sweetwater at about 3:30, and Biggio had to make a position report. He pulled to the right of the main group to check his radio facility chart, and looking to the left, he saw the plane flown by Stem and Cornelia flying extremely close together. Stem had just turned 23. He had entered flight school the previous April and had become a flight officer in December. He had 267 hours in the air, about a quarter of what Cornelia Ford had, although he, like the others, had more experience flying larger planes. Again, the BT-13 was the basic trainer. It was larger than most of the trainers that these women had been ferrying. Over rough, hilly country about 10 miles south of Merkel, Biggio saw Cornelia's plane suddenly break off to the right as though in a snap roll. Stem told investigators, I glanced to my right and rear just in time to see the other plane off my right trailing wing. The ship seemed to be in a slight turn or skid, with the wing slightly tilted. The collision was unavoidable as far as my doing anything about it, even though my reaction was to pull up, causing what he believed to be her canopy to hit his right landing gear. In the split second all this happened, I noticed the pilot in the other ship had her left arm raised as if to ward off a blow or shield her face from something. I never saw the pilot raise her arm. It was in that position when I first saw her. What actually struck Stem's landing gear was Cornelia's left wing, according to the AAF crash report. The tip of the wing, which was made of wood, and the other was entirely metal, had snapped off, and the impact peeled 6 feet of her wing's leading edge toward the fuselage. Biggio watched as Cornelia's plane spun slowly down until he lost sight of her beneath his wing. It rolled several times, went into an inverted dive, rotated slowly to the left, and slammed vertically into the ground. It plowed several feet into the red soil and never moved or caught fire. Most likely, said Lieutenant Sparks, who investigated the crash, the engine was buried so deeply underground and so quickly that the bulk of the fuel, which was in the wing tanks, did not have time to ignite. The initial impact with Stem's plane had apparently knocked Cornelia unconscious or killed her instantly. She made no attempt to open the emergency hatch on the latch release and apparently did not try to right the plane. The plane was too badly damaged to tell if she had turned off the ignition following the collision, although the plane lost power almost immediately afterward. Stem had maintained control of his lightly damaged aircraft. He and Biggio circled at a very low altitude, as did 2 others. Biggio looking for smoke or flame or for any sign of a crash, and saw nothing. He concluded that Cornelia had pulled out of the spin and he headed toward Dallas, as did all the others except for Stem. When he arrived, Biggio learned that Cornelia had crashed. They circled simply for the fact the engine was buried so deep in the dirt that it had not caught fire, and they could not find what was sticking out of the soil, of the wreckage that was sticking out of the soil. Stem headed back to Abilene. I made an emergency landing in the dirt next to the runway, he told investigators, believing that I had washed out my landing gear. The Associated Press quoted unofficial sources in Abilene as saying witnesses had seen two planes tip wings before Cornelius went out of control. Nearby farmers heard the crash and came running to the site, a pasture 2 miles southeast of the little town of Nubia. Nubia is a ghost town now. The Army training base, Fort Barkley. Fort Barkley was located in that area, and the government had bought land from farmers and ranchers all around Nubia to establish Fort Barkley, so the town just disintegrated and deteriorated. The little town of Nubia. When they arrived, the plane lay still and broken in the bright Texas sun. Betty Jo Seymour, a 14-year-old from a nearby farm, saw scalp and hair in a tree not far from the plane. Cornelia's body had essentially exploded upon impact, and they knew the pilot had been a woman. Another neighbor, H.H. Cargill, found an insignia pin and a piece of Cornelia's watch, which had been smashed flat. There were only 60 pounds of remains that could be collected and shipped back to Nashville. Cornelia had weighed 140 pounds. Mr. and Mrs. Clyde Latimer and Joe Seymour, Betty Jo's father, stood guard at the site until Army personnel arrived. I kind of have to stop there for a minute. Almost at once, rumors began circulating that Stem had been hot dogging, trying to scare or impress Cornelia into during the flight. Many of the WAFs had seen such action from young male pilots. The story, reprinted in several books about the WAFs, was that Stem had been showing off and that in doing a rollover, Cornelia's plane, his plane, struck hers, causing the crash. There is no evidence that any such thing happened. It is known that they were flying closer together than was permitted and that her wings struck his landing gear. Either could have made the split-second decision, mental error, that resulted in the collision. Stem had less than 30 hours in the air, but Cornelia had precious little experience flying anything other than tiny planes. Once the collision took place, the wooden wing of Cornelia's plane helped assure it would be fatal. B.J. Erickson, head of the Long Beach WAF, said she believed the collision was accidental. They were in 2 or 3 airplanes out there in the middle of nowhere, flying in formation. I don't think there was anything malicious about it. I think it was just an accident. The Army interviewed all the pilots in the air, none of whom discussed the fact that they had been flying in formation, and all those who saw and interviewed all those who saw it from the ground. The cause of the accident, the report said, was 100% judgment, momentary lapse of mental efficiency, general lack of alertness, etc. It did not assign blame. Cornelia Ford, at 24, became the first woman pilot to die on active duty in the United States military. So, and I read the part about the crash because the 38 WASP who died, when you go back and you read the accident reports and what the investigators said, never once was it a faulty aircraft. Never once was it, although male pilots did try to antagonize the WASP and the WAFs, never once was it someone else causing it. It was every single, of all 38 accident reports, it was pilot error. So, you take a woman like Cornelia Ford, who'd gone through what she had done, who was so bright, you can't imagine that she intentionally, and like the other WASP, did not think that it was a malicious crash, but, you know, you have to be skeptical. There were rumors that the WASP planes were sabotaged. There were stories of sugar being put in gas tanks at fields where they really did not want women pilots to fly. And, you know, there was just lots of gender bias. But at the same time, you got to realize that while the WASP were going through gender bias, you have on the other hand the unit of Tuskegee Airmen who gender bias paled as opposed to racial violence and the physical harm that came to these men. I mean, they were physically mistreated, the WASP were not. So you have two groups of people that were serving their country under very, very harsh circumstances. Last week, I got a letter from a Japanese American. This man had flown had enlisted in the Air Force before Pearl Harbor. Yet, here he was serving in the military protecting the United States, and his family, who lived on the West Coast, were put in internment camps. So you had the WASP with gender bias, you had the Tuskegee Airmen with racial bias, and then you had the Japanese with national or heritage bias. So it was a hard time. It was a hard time for lots of people. But the thing we can never ever forget, that when the bell rang and it was time to step up to save our country, these people did. I was 3 years old when Pearl Harbor was bombed. And I can remember every night my family being, no matter what you were doing, when the 6 o'clock news came on the radio, the whole family sat at that radio and they listened. My mother lived in mortal fear every time a plane flew over. We lived on a farm. And when a plane flew over, Mother would come and get us out of the yard and make us come in. She lived in mortal fear that one of those planes would be a Japanese plane. My parents lived in Atlanta when the first Japanese submarine was spotted off of the east coast of the United States. It's hard to make people who did not live through that time realize what fear and what distress U.S. citizens lived under at that time, knowing that there was a real possibility that there could be conflict on our soil. So, you know, I can't impress upon you, and I am preaching to the choir, I know, but this generation, the generation that I'm the tail end of, we're truly America's greatest generation, and I only hope that if we're ever pressed into service, that I feel like we will, but how do we know? And that's the reason I enjoy so telling the story of these women to young people. So hopefully they will be able to take up the flag when needed. So, does anyone have anything they would like to add to the Cornelia Ford story? Have any of you seen the historical marker out at Mulberry Canyon? I shall repeat its location. This is going to be on the quiz as you walk out the door. What did I? Is it 280 and 1086 and 280? You can Google Cornelia Ford. It's on Highway 126 and Farm to Market 1085 in Mulberry Canyon. So
how would you get there?
If you go to Merkel, I think it's 126 that heads off of I-20.
Heads out south.
Yeah.
Almost.
Yes, south, north-south, yes. I have to throw a rock.
It goes through Mulberry
Yes,
Canyon.
yeah.
And Newby, you'll go, well.
Is there anything left of Newby? I Googled Newby and the Google said Newby was a ghost town.
Last time I was there was an old two-story house on the west side of the road. That's been a good while. That's all's left of Newby.
You know, it breaks my heart that it took me so long in my adult life to appreciate the heritage that we have wherever I have lived. And it's not, I'm not that unusual, I don't think. We're also busy with our daily lives. Men are busy establishing careers. Women are busy raising families, that we forget to look at the stars and learn the constellations, or look at the birds and learn their migratory habits. And certainly, we are too busy to research and seek out and make mental note of the historic happenings in our area. But the last time I was here for a presentation, a woman from Abilene, from the Texas Historic Society, or Abilene Historic Society, was talking about establishing Texas historical markers, and she, it was made note that this Cornelia Ford marker was there. But and then off of 70 from Sweetwater headed toward San Angelo, about 12 miles out of Sweetwater, there's another historical marker. During during the war, there was a Air Force plane that crashed, I think with a crew of 8, and all of them were killed on one of those plateaus that between Sweetwater and San Angelo. But, you know, you think about, it's really easy to cover that country now in a car with paved roads. But back then, you were just real lucky to have 2 little ruts running between fence posts to get through that part of the country. So, and I don't know, and speaking of roads, I don't know how many of you all are interested or know of the Bankhead Highway, but the reason that Avenger Field was built where it is was because Sweetwater was a railroad hub. There were 5 major railroads that converged in Sweetwater. Well, in 1919, as they were realizing that you had to have roads for armies and citizens to travel on in case of an emergency, the Lincoln Highway had been built, the Northeast Transcontinental Highway had been built from New York to San Francisco, and then that was built in 1917. Then in 1919, the Bankhead Highway was built. Texas is 1/3 of the Bankhead Highway, so it was with 4 major railroads and the Bankhead Highway running through Sweetwater. That was a perfect place for a flight training base. There were no forests, there were no mountains. I mean, you know, my husband's a golfer, and he's always said, if you could learn to play golf and you can learn to fly in West Texas, you can play golf and you can fly anywhere in the world. So this was a wonderful, Sweetwater was a wonderful spot a perfect spot for a flight training school. It's a terrible spot to have a museum because we're so isolated and we're so small, which made it a good flight training base, because there's no way to raise money. We are so far removed from large cities. But it was perfect for what it was used for then. So, and the lady back here, you knew a WASP.
Oh, yes, we were privileged to know Ruth Flory. That was one. She had a lake house next to us on Brownwood Lake, and she was just exactly probably like Mrs. Ford. She was very adventurous. She had a sailboat, and later in life, when she took a little bit of more of a sedentary life, she was a potter, and she had her own wheel and everything. She was a very talented lady, not only as a pilot, but all the other things. And she was from Odessa, and so.
Yeah. No, a lot of these women were very creative. It's that right brain, left brain thing, I guess. They were creative in the air. They were adventurous. They didn't have to march that straight line of the norm. And a lot of them went on to be artists, to be sculptors. Some of them were fine equestrians and had stables of horses and were nationally known writing teachers. They went on to have wonderful, wonderful careers. And it's so funny when you talk to WASP children, there are 2 distinct groups. The group on the left had no idea what their mother did during World War II. They kind of heard she did something, but they didn't know. Then you got the group on the right. And those kids thought everybody's mother flew a plane in World War II. They were exceptional women, and I hope I didn't bore you by reading to you, but there would be no way I could share the impact of her first seeing the Japanese over Pearl Harbor or her terrible crash without reading it to you. So I hope you come and visit our museum. Not only do you get to see, hear, and smell things, but if it's hot, you get to feel how hot it was for these women training in Sweetwater. And when it's cold, you know how many layers of clothes they had to put on to stay warm when they lived in Sweetwater. So thank you for coming. It's been a pleasure. Does anyone else have anything they would like to say? Or
I was wondering, you mentioned there's 7 military museums in the West Texas area,
Yes.
but I only got down to 6, so I just wondered if you could read
Okay.
them off to me.
Abilene 12th Armored,
Yeah.
Sweetwater,
Yeah.
Big Spring, Midland. I did overlook Midland. You know, Midland used to be CAF headquarters, but they moved the headquarters to Dallas. The CAF High Plains unit still maintains a hangar and a museum and a huge, what do you call it? It's not a workshop, place where you work on planes in Midland, and that's a nice little museum. Then you go on further west is Monahan's. Then northwest is Slayton and Lubbock.
Okay.
Is that all 7? And then the Wasp Museum. I didn't name Wasp.
Well, I was in Adventure Field.
Yeah. We're number 7.
Yeah. So, and then did you say at Monahan's? I thought you said there was another town.
Pyote was where the actual base was located, but there's nothing left of Pyote. Pyote's like Nubia. It disappeared too. And there is nothing left of the base. And if you go to our website, on this card is the museum website, and on our website we have a map of all 7 of those museums. Our BT-13, like I said earlier, is supposed to arrive in the middle of August. We're going to have wonderful festivities. We're hoping to have more than one BT-13. That is a plane that was not a favorite plane of the Wasp. It was made by Vultee, and they called it the Vultee Vibrator. And there are not very many BT. You must know the BT-13. I see you shaking your head.
I know a guy that had one
Had
over
one.
at Abilene.
Yeah.
Tiny Mall.
Yep, new, and I'm so
BT-13.
sorry that we lost him.
Yeah.
And we called him, what was his name? Not Sonny,
But we called him Tiny.
Tiny, that's it.
Tiny.
Yes, Tiny. And he was about the size of this
He
TV
was
set.
tiny,
He was
but
a big,
tiny.
about the size of the organ, yes. Tiny was a perfect name for him. A very congenial man, yes. But there are not a lot of BT-13s left. We want our museum to have all 5 of the trainers that were based there. The only thing we will be lacking when the BT-13 arrives is an AT-6, and there are lots of AT-6s around, simply for the fact the AT-6 was the Wasp's favorite plane to fly, because when it's so funny to hear these little bitty shriveled up women, and they'll go, "What's your favorite plane?" and they'll go, "Well, it was the AT-6." "Well, why did you like it?" "Well, because it went so fast." So, I think everybody likes the AT-6. And it's a beautiful aircraft. But come and see us if you have a Girl Scout group, if you have a Sunday school group, or a reading club. Fannie Flagg has written a really, it's not historically correct, but she's written a very entertaining book about the Wasp. All you gotta do is call, and you can have your private tour of our museum, and I want you to know the story so you can share the story with the young people in your life. The booklets that I gave you are part of our educational outreach, and you'll notice that there's a signature on almost all of them. Some of them don't have signatures, but most of them do. We send these booklets to prospective donors all over the United States, and donors sign them and send them back to our museum with a donation, so that we can use these booklets to make sure that any school child, any class that comes to our museum, or any teacher who is teaching American history can call us and we will send these booklets telling the lost story to them anywhere in the United States. This is part of our educational outreach. For those of you who know teachers or are teachers yourselves, we have another part of our educational outreach is Fifi's Suitcase. And any teacher, whether it be a public school, a university, Girl Scout Council, a homeschooling group, can call us and we will share Fifi's Suitcase. It contains videos and books and recordings, the music that was played back then, samples of the stamps that you had, the rationing stamps, booklets, and pieces of uniforms so kids can create their own play or skit, whatever having to do with the Women's Air Force Service pilots. We just want to make sure that this story is told. So there we go. I thank you, and I expect to see every single. I have a memory like an elephant's. I will remember if you do not come.